of the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, or CEDAC. I am pleased to welcome you to this forum, Chapter 40T at 10, Lessons from the First 10 Years of the Massachusetts Housing Preservation Law. 2009 was a landmark year for housing preservation efforts in our state. After a very long process, with the active participation of key stakeholders, the legislature enacted and the governor signed Chapter 40T. DHCD and CEDAC received important philanthropic support from the MacArthur Foundation's Housing Preservation Initiative, which allows us to manage a database of subsidized multifamily developments in the state that serves as an early warning system for projects at risk of market conversion. The database contains over 145,000 units statewide. We also launched a preservation acquisition fund with our partners at the Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation so that preservation purchasers would have ready access to financing that would allow them to purchase properties that become available through the 40T process. And we established formal convenings of an interagency preservation working group with our state partners, Mass Housing, MHP, Mass Development, and of course DHCD, as well as federal partners and local partners from the city of Boston. Preservation requires coordination. 2009 resonates today as we also were in the throes of a very serious economic recession. We currently are living through very tragic and serious crises: health, economic, racial, and political. We appreciate you taking the time to join us for this forum. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, but let me start with a few housekeeping matters. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at CEDAC's website at www.cedac.org. After our presentations, the panelists will be taking audience questions, so please offer your questions through Zoom's Q&A function. If you do have any technical difficulties, please contact Pearl Chan in our office. You should have received her email address when you registered, and we'll do our best to resolve the problem. We'll also add her contact info into the chat. But of course, we are in a brave new world when it comes to technology, so please bear with us. We will begin by hearing from a leader who bears major responsibility for the passage of Chapter 40T in the legislature. Representative Kevin Honan has served in the legislature since 1987, representing the Allston-Brighton neighborhood where he was born and raised. As chair of the Joint Committee on Housing for the past 16 years, Kevin led the process to address the expiring use housing challenge. He also has led efforts to secure the necessary state bond funding that allows preservation transactions to happen, most recently with the $1.8 billion housing bond bill in 2018. It is my great honor to welcome Kevin Honan.
Thank you very much, Roger. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, part of this wonderful celebration of 40T. What can I say? This law has protected thousands of units over the last 10, 11 years. And it's very important during these difficult times of COVID that we come together to celebrate this law. The housing community in Massachusetts is a very tight group. We all know each other, and we've all been isolated with COVID. So, Roger, I want to thank you for convening this celebration to inform people of the successes of 40T, and I thank Bill Brauner for all of his research. The Housing Committee in the legislature has over the years focused its attention on preservation, production, and homelessness. And we've been very active on all of those fronts for the past 17 years that I've been the chair of the Housing Committee. And Roger, it has always been a pleasure to work with you. The bill, the protection period that was created by 40T has been critically important in our preservation efforts here and protecting low-income tenants as well. 40T, again, has preserved thousands of units in Massachusetts. It encourages tenants, property owners, CDCs, preservation developers, city and state officials to work together to find equitable solutions. 40T has been a success. 40T is one of the most valuable tools we have here in Massachusetts to preserve our housing stock, along with bond authorizations and tax credits. And we all worked together in that $1.8 billion bond bill that we were so proud of a few years ago. As is the case with any bill going through the legislative process, we saw how important it was with 40T to all work together with legislators from all around Massachusetts. So many were impacted by expiring use properties, so it was critically important to form coalitions within the legislature, and we had a well-balanced finished product. The solid law was the product of hard work, and we had some extraordinary partners. During the negotiation, you'll remember some groups threatened to walk away from the table. We have to remember that, but in the end, for the greater good, everyone came back together again. Some of our partners were obviously Vince O'Donnell and Roger Herzog, Bill Brauner, and the entire CEDAC team. My then co-chair was Senator Sue Tucker, and she had an extraordinary legislative aide named Rachel Heller. And we all know Rachel, who's now the CEO at CHAPA. So we all worked together there. We had the HUD Tenants Alliance with Michael Kane, Joe Kreisberg and the CDCs. The staff, Aaron Gornstein was involved in so many issues back in that day. But we had the DHCD staff as well. And I know Roberta Rubin is on the call, and we've worked with Roberta on a number of issues in Allston Brighton that still exist. The very first, so I was elected in 1987, as Roger said. The first issue I was involved in was expiring use. We got a call from the 10 o'clock news on Channel 2 who were doing a story on Glenville Ave in Allston, which was an issue. That was the first time I was interviewed as a legislator in early 1987. I also, Agnes Porter, who I worked with at ABCD, was a tenant at 1295 Comm Ave, and Luis Sorrell, who was a tenant on Glenville Ave. He was the leader of the maintenance workers at Boston College, and I met him when I was a student when he was cleaning the cafeteria where the commuters usually had lunch. They were involved in organizing the tenants, working very closely with the Allston Brighton Community Development Corporation to preserve their units. And it was a successful project called Commonwealth Ave, Glenville Ave, to preserve those units. My community is also impacted with hundreds of other units that are impacted to this day. This law still helps over in Allston and Brighton. So to me, it's not just legislative, it's a personal issue impacting my constituents. 40T is a prime example of what we can accomplish when we all work together. It has been such a privilege to work with so many dedicated housing advocates and policy experts over the course of my time as chair of the Housing Committee. I look forward to working with you and hearing from this panel discussion, but I look forward to working with all of you again in the next legislative session, and hopefully we can convene in my office at the State House or somewhere else in the downtown area. But again, I want to thank you, Roger and Bill, for all your work on 40T, and I do think it's important, particularly during these difficult times, to celebrate our accomplishments that we've had here in Massachusetts. Obviously, we have an extraordinary housing community, both for-profit, nonprofit. We have activists all over state, and we all work together. So Roger, again, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this very important forum, and look forward to working with you on many other issues. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Chairman Honan, for your leadership and for reminding us that indeed all politics is local. You learned about this issue firsthand on the streets of Alston-Brighton. Now I'm going to give brief introductions for our speakers. All of the participants in this webinar should have received information and bios about our speakers, so please make sure to check these out for more information. Priya Jayachandran is the president of the National Housing Trust, which she has led since 2018. She'll be offering the keynote remarks for today's event, and we'll be talking about the future of housing preservation. Bill Brauner is CEDAC's Director of Housing Preservation and Policy, and he is the author of the report looking at the impact of Chapter 40T a decade since it became law. Rachel Heller is the CEO of CHAPA, and as Chairman Honan reminded us, was a staffer in the Senate when 40T was enacted. Rachel became CHAPA's CEO in 2016 after joining it as the Director of Public Policy in 2012. Suneeth John is the Director of Real Estate at the Fenway Community Development Corporation in Boston, where he focuses on sourcing housing development opportunities for the Fenway community. And finally, Roberta Rubin is the Chief Counsel at the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development, where she has been since 2015. As many of you know, we work very closely with DHCD, especially when it comes to these kinds of housing preservation projects. Thank you all for being part of our panel today, and I will now turn it over to Priya Jayachandran. Priya?
Great, thank you so much, Roger, and thank you to CEDAC for the invitation to join you today. Congratulations to CEDAC and the entire Massachusetts affordable housing community for the celebration of the 10-year anniversary of Chapter 40T. I lead, as Roger mentioned, National Housing Trust, and we frequently celebrate and point to Chapter 40T as a model law for housing preservation. We do regular work with state HFAs around the country and often share 40T as an example of what other states and localities can aspire to. I have spent the last 20 years of my career in Washington, D.C., both at a state, and a national and a local level, but have been familiar with some of the activity in Massachusetts throughout my career, and candidly, a little jealous of the community you all have up there, of folks that work so closely and cooperatively together. And so many of them have intersected with NHT over the years. Bill Brauner is a regular and active participant in the preservation working group that we convene. Crystal Cornegay, Director of Mass Housing, has been on our board and is such a mentor and friend to me. And Aaron Gornstein is the chair of the Board of SAFE, and NHT is a SAFE member, and also POA and TCB are such models of affordable housing developers, but more than developers, advocates and policy influencers. So I really admire everything that you've done up in Massachusetts. Roger and Bill gave me the opportunity this morning to share a few of my thoughts about the future of housing preservation. And I thought by starting a little bit with the history, which most of you know probably better than I do. And I imagine many of you know my predecessor, Michael Bedakin, who was in many of these fights and victories with you all. NHT was founded, as I mentioned, over 30 years ago to focus exclusively on affordable housing preservation. It was at a time when the original stock of subsidized housing was reaching the end of its expiry, and no one, as is frequently happens in Washington, ever contemplated what would happen when those 30 or 40 years lapsed and suddenly they were approaching. NHT's first years were focused largely on a legislative and advocacy effort, and working with local actors like all of you. Together, we helped pass MARA in the late 90s, which gave an off-ramp, or I should say an on-ramp or a way to stay on the freeway for so much of the subsidized stock. We worked with Vince and others on programs like LIPRA, creating new programs and thinking about how we can preserve so much of the subsidized stock. We quickly realized that advocacy and legislation were one tool, so were real estate development and finance, and we became a CDFI, started as a development consultant, and quickly became a real estate owner ourselves. We've now developed and preserved 10,000 affordable housing units, 3,000 to 4,000 of which we still actively control and manage. And then about 10 to 15 years ago, we got into sustainability and energy retrofits for affordable housing, seeing that as an extension of our work on housing preservation. At the same time, folks like CEDAC and their counterparts around the country were working on state and local efforts to preserve housing with victories like Chapter 40T. DC has its Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and more recently its District Opportunity to Purchase Act, DOPA, which is in large measure modeled on Chapter 40T. So with this sound legacy, what does the future of housing preservation look like? And as I mentioned, Roger and Bill have given me a few minutes to share my take on what I think housing preservation over the next 10 to 20 years can and maybe should look like, building on that strong foundation that we've all built together. The first is, I would argue that we should embrace a broader conception of housing preservation. Heretofore, and I'll only focus on NHT, we've largely focused our efforts on the subsidized stock. And even within the subsidized stock, a fairly narrow sliver of that, largely federally subsidized programs like PBRA, otherwise known as Project-Based Section 8, 236, 202s, 811 units. With the publication of Evicted a few years ago by Matt Desmond, with all of the research coming out on the growing homelessness population, and the data that increasingly shows that the vast majority of affordable housing is in fact in unsubsidized units that fall under the radar, I would argue that housing preservation should expand to think more broadly about preserving affordable housing as opposed to thinking exclusively about preserving subsidized housing. And again, that's really a transition that NHT is making, and I am suggesting that the broader field go in the same direction of thinking, how do we preserve housing as a concept more broadly, and even go beyond units and preserving the concept of home, thinking about eviction prevention and preserving somebody's home, a right to a home, versus necessarily a brick and mortar unit. The unsubsidized stock, as we all know, is a conundrum. The very fact that it's not within the system means that it's harder to track. We don't always know those owners. We don't know where those units are located, but the data suggests that we need to. So much of affordable housing is outside of the system and equally vulnerable, and vulnerable to new threats, not just losing the stock, but the quality issues that have plagued affordable housing for so long. How do we add quality control to those units? How do we get long-term preservation? How do we support those owners and motivate and incentivize them to keep their properties, be them single-family rentals, threeplexes, and other stock affordable for the long run? The second future intersection or trend that I'd like to suggest is a greater linkage between housing preservation and climate change. As preservationists, I think we've long argued that housing preservation is a more environmental housing solution than is necessarily new construction. But I think we can make that argument more strongly for a number of reasons. Clearly, climate change is here to stay, and the new Biden administration is making it a priority, naming Massachusetts' own John Kerry as the climate czar. And clearly, there's going to be an emphasis, hopefully, an infrastructure package that will include work on climate change. And I think the more that we can link housing preservation to infrastructure and climate change, to share that the energy burden from new construction, from all aspects of that, from the materials cost, from the transportation of those new materials, from the construction costs, the whole process is much more energy consumptive than is housing preservation. So how can we partner with our energy advocates to make that claim? I'd say housing and the energy field, you think about organizations like NRDC, Sierra Club, have not been natural allies, but that doesn't mean that they don't have to be or can be in the future. And how do we forge those partnerships to make preservation an environmental issue as well as a housing issue? The third is including new construction in our toolbox, notwithstanding what I just said about energy consumption. The reality is that we need to be preserving units and creating units at the same time. When NHT was created in 1990 to focus on preservation, it was because housing preservation was the most pressing affordable housing issue of our time. It continues to be pressing, but the reality today is that even if we preserve every one of our units, it's not enough. We have simply not built up over the past 30 years the way we should have. And any toolbox and any affordable housing strategy has to have preservation and new construction, new supply, walking hand in hand. And how do we continue our focus, our expertise on preservation, and create space and acknowledge the role that new supply and new construction play? Fourth is opportunity and location. This is a hard one. In my career, you often had preservationists on one side, and I'll call them opportunists, it's not the right word, on the other, folks that were focused on mobility. I think that binary choice is no longer relevant. The Raj Chetty research and Nathan Hendren research that came out in 2015 sealed the deal. Location does matter. And I think that we have to acknowledge the role that zip code plays in outcomes. Clearly, we want to preserve units. At the same time, we have to acknowledge the history of systemic racism in placing many of those units in places that don't naturally lead to opportunity. And I think continuing to work with our friends and colleagues who advocate for mobility on what are the solutions, like eliminating source of income discrimination, creating greater opportunities for voucher penetration, thinking about solutions like Section 8BB for PBRA to move subsidy contracts. They're complicated, they're small scale, but we can't ignore the role that location plays on opportunity. Nor can we ignore the role that location plays on resilience and vulnerability to water. NHT and Climate Central published a report just last week on affordable housing's vulnerability to sea level rise. And in fact, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey were prominently featured. Most people, including me, naturally assume that Texas, Puerto Rico, Florida are the vulnerable places. We don't realize how much of the stock in the Northeast is vulnerable. And how do we think about preserving housing, but also preserving opportunity for those folks who are vulnerable to those conditions because of choices that we and our counterparts made over the years in placing that housing? There are no easy solutions here. And even in the report, we recommend further thought and action. There's not a magic wand. We all know that moving units costs more money than heretofore our policymakers and us, because we're taxpayers and our policymakers reflect our priorities, have been willing to appropriate. But nor can we ignore the problem. The final trend that I will point to are new demographic shifts. I think we've all seen in recent census data the changing demographics, and the one that always jumps out for me is the number of households that now, unmarried households that live without children. 28% of adults are living alone or with partnered without unmarried and without kids. What this means as we age is that existing or older models of support systems may not serve us well going forward. And I would argue that as preservationists, we should be promoting and preserving models of housing, including intergenerational housing, that can serve us into the future. A couple years ago, I read, and of course at the moment the name is escaping me, Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, that profiled, among others, models of intergenerational or supported services housing, including ones in Massachusetts. They're still few and far between, and like it or not, we're all aging. And I think that we need to be thinking about, as preservationists, preserving models that are going to allow people to age in place. Because when you ask Americans, and I ask myself, how do I want to age? It's in my home. But the reality is, without people around me, without supports, I may not be able to do that. And I think it's on us to think about and be promoting models of affordable housing that allow Americans to do that with dignity. So I'll conclude by saying congratulations again on 40T. I think it's a model law, and I think it's an exciting opportunity in celebrating its 10-year anniversary for all of us to think about what are the 40Ts of the future? How has the field changed in large measure to our own success? And what are those new laws, those chapter 40Zs that we should aspire to and promote as best practices? And we all around the country always look to Massachusetts as a leader in this space, so really excited to see where you all lead us. Thank you, Roger and Bill, for the opportunity.
Many thanks, Priya, for that really excellent, creative look at the trends that are coming at us and new ways of thinking about how these aspects of our modern life interact. Very provocative, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Now it's time to hear from Bill on the research around the outcomes from the first 10 years of 40T.
Thanks, Roger. So I'm Bill Brauner, Director of Housing Preservation and Policy at CEDAC, and I'd like to share with you the results of some research that I've done in the first 10 years of 40T's existence. So I'm going to go over the overview of the statute. I'm going to share some outcomes and also some conclusions. as to why these outcomes were reached. So for the overview, first of all, for the Massachusetts housing geeks out there, feel free to get another cup of coffee, you know this stuff. But also to everyone else, just to share that 40T is a complex law, and I'm going to go over a very high concept view of it. So please be aware, there's plenty in the law that I'm not going to cover in my talk. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for just a minute. There we go. So as Roger commented, Chapter 40T was enacted in late 2009, and it covers properties funded with 16 identified housing programs. They include the major production programs, Section 236, 202, 13A, LIHTC, and major project-based rental subsidy programs such as Section 8 and MRVP. But it's important to remember that a number of housing programs are not covered. The law has three main aspects: notices, tenant protections, and the right of first offer and right of first refusal. So let me comment on the concept of a termination for Chapter 40T. Under the statute, a termination is the end of an affordable housing restriction without the simultaneous replacement with an equivalent restriction. So examples would be a mortgage maturity for a Section 236 or 13A. It could be a Section 8 contract expiration, or the end of a tax credit use restriction. So the first component of the law are notices. There's several types, but I'm only going to mention three. The first one is a 2-year notice, and this must be sent by owners at least 24 months prior to a termination. Similarly, there's a 1-year notice. And I also want to mention the offer to sell notice. This is sent by an owner who proposes to sell an affordable housing project without ongoing affordability. I'll talk about this more in a minute. Notices must be sent to tenants, all the tenants at a property, any tenant organization at the property, the city, CEDAC, DHCD, and the local legal services organization. A second component of the statute, are tenant protections. So for 3 years after a termination, rents cannot be increased by more than the CPI plus 3% for low-income residents who do not receive enhanced vouchers. And the third component, arguably the heart of the law, is the right of first offer and right of first refusal. It starts with DHCD receiving an offer to sell notice, indicating that an owner wants to sell a covered affordable housing project without ongoing affordability. Upon receiving an offer to sell, DHCD will then designate a pre-qualified preservation buyer to act on behalf of the state. And for 90 days after the offer to sell notice is received, the owner cannot accept any offer except from the designee. However, the owner is not required to accept the offer. It may appear that a non-binding right of first offer is fairly toothless, but that has not been our experience. Of the 14 projects that have been purchased to date by designees, 10 of them were purchased with the right of first offer. After the end of the right of first offer period, the owner is able to sign a purchase and sale agreement with a third-party buyer. However, with the right of first refusal, the designee can step into the shoes of a third-party buyer. 40T has restrictions on the minimum terms in the P&S that the designee signs. The goal was to avoid the temptation for a seller to craft a P&S where a designee could not possibly perform. To date, there have been 4 acquisitions using the right of first refusal. There are a number of property transfers that are exempt from the 40T right of first offer and right of first refusal. I'll mention two of them. The first, and a very important one, is a sale to a buyer that preserves affordability for at least 30 years. In this situation, the seller and the buyer jointly agree that the property will remain affordable. Also, affiliate transfers that are not also a termination are exempt. Typically, in this case, the property remains controlled by the same parent organization, but has a different ownership entity. This is particularly common for LIHTC transactions. So in my research, here are some of the notices that I looked at. So during the 10-year period, there were a total of 606 notices received for 326 projects. As you can see, there were 145 projects had termination notices, and there were 196 exemption requests. And of these, 83 were sales preserving affordability. Finally, there were 21 offer to sell notices. Of these offer to sell notices, 14 properties with 1,307 affordable units were purchased by designees, and 7 designations did not result in the sale. So 4 properties were not sold at all and remained affordable for at least several years later. At least 3 of these continue to be affordable. 2 properties were sold to market buyers with a loss of 204 affordable units. And 1 30-unit property is not yet fully resolved, likely to be a partial preservation with about half the units preserved. And here's the tally for units preserved over the first 10 years. Interestingly, there were more properties preserved through the right of first offer, but more units preserved through the right of first refusal. However, exempt sales preserving affordability dwarf the designee purchases. This is because most owners of affordable housing properties have been marketing and selling their properties to preservation buyers rather than to try to do a market sale. In total, the right of first offer, right of first refusal, and exempt sales preserving affordability, 97 properties, almost 9,600 units. And finally, other exempt transfers, many of these were affiliate transfers, were totaled 99 properties, a little over 10,000 units. So all told, 196 properties and almost 20,000 units. Looking at why we had this success, a number of things jump out. The biggest one is that consistent DHCD support for 40T was the biggest factor. DHCD devotes 1,000 hours of staff time, about half a full-time equivalent, per year in routine administration of the law, as well as extensive time every time there's a designation in process. In addition, and very importantly, DHCD has provided consistent funding for housing preservation and includes the Housing Preservation Matrix ranking tool in the Qualified Allocation Plan. As part of my research, I reviewed housing preservation laws in 15 other jurisdictions. 12 of these laws have a right of first refusal or a right of first offer. Chapter T really stands out for its effectiveness. Most other public agencies have not devoted the resources toward the ongoing support for the law and for preservation transactions. For example, my contacts in Maine could only document a single project that had been preserved through the state's right of first refusal. In most jurisdictions, I was not able to find evidence that any projects had been preserved through their right of first offer or right of first refusal. In addition to DHCD, Massachusetts has developed what I think of as a preservation ecosystem that provides a broad range of support for preservation. The question is not, should we preserve this project, but has become, how do we preserve this project? A really important difference. Here are some of the components of the ecosystem. So acquisition finance, CEDAC, along with a few other CDFIs, is able to provide high loan-to-value acquisition financing for preservation buyers. And of course, experienced preservation developers are key. Massachusetts is fortunate to be the home of many high-capacity developers, including large nonprofits such as Preservation of Affordable Housing and Community Builders, along with for-profits such as Beacon and Shochet. And community development corporations, including Fenway CDC, have frequently punched above their weight and closed some extremely complicated preservation transactions. Organized tenants have been a really important factor in a number of high-profile preservations. Technical assistance, this is an important focus for CEDAC, but other agencies also provide TA, and we can't ignore the importance of experienced consultants and attorneys here in Massachusetts. Interagency cooperation is very important, since often HUD or Mass Housing or DHCD will only have part of the story about what's happening in a project. The Preservation Interagency Working Group has been meeting regularly for 10 years now. We also have a State Preservation Advisory Committee and the CHAPA Production and Preservation Committee, all help with cooperation between and among agencies. The legislature's support of housing preservation through bond bills and the funding of the state housing tax credit, extremely important. And finally, some cities, such as Boston and Cambridge, have provided extensive local support for affordable housing preservation. In fact, the state's Preservation Interagency Working Group is modeled on the Boston Interdepartmental Preservation Working Group. But we have to acknowledge there's limitations to 40T. The biggest one is that the right of first offer and right of first refusal only regulates sales. So if an owner does not want to sell, there's very little the state can do to preserve the housing. And in fact, statistics show that. We've lost 204 units to sales, but we've lost many, many more for owners who did not sell and just converted their property to market. And of course, the right of first offer and right of first refusal are at market value. So some preservation projects have a high potential value if they are converted to market. And these high acquisition costs will limit the number of preservation projects that the state can take on. So overall, during the first 10 years, 40T has been a big success, contributing to the preservation of almost 20,000 units while only losing 204. So I'll stop here and pass it on to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. You've done a great job on this research and for providing the TA to so many preservation projects, and the results indicate the success of that effort. So we are now going to move to our panel, and I'm going to ask all the panelists to turn on their cameras and microphones, and we will hear first from Rachel.
Good morning. We all know that, well, first, actually, I want to thank CEDAC and I want to thank Bill for this great research, because it's incredibly helpful to see the impacts of this policy and to understand where we need to do more work. We all know that housing is expensive in Massachusetts and incomes are not keeping pace with the cost of home prices or rent. And this is impacting people across income levels, and it hits those with lowest incomes the hardest. Over 275,000 households in Massachusetts have extremely low incomes, and more than 50% of those households are paying more than half of their income towards housing costs. This is even more acute during the pandemic as the illness continues to spread, as unemployment persists, as kids are not in school for more than a few hours a day, making it really challenging for parents to work. Through the pandemic, we've been working hard to secure more emergency rental assistance to help people stay in their homes. Ultimately, we know that long-term affordable housing is the solution. So in Massachusetts, we are fortunate that our policymakers believe in affordable housing. We are one of the few states that have a state and federal public housing stock. We have multiple state rental assistance programs, and we have a state low-income housing tax credit and bond programs that help to finance the production and the preservation of affordable housing. Even with all these programs, we cannot meet the needs. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston found that we have a shortage of about 140,000 homes for people with extremely low income. So every affordable home that we have in this state really matters. Every person that lives in each of these homes matters. And we need to work hard to preserve this stock and to grow this stock. Chapter 40T is critical to preserving our stock of affordable housing. Now, getting that law into place was not easy, and there are many, many people who played a role in getting it passed. Advocates and legislators like Representative Kevin Honan had been working for years to get a bill passed. But getting to a bill that was strong and meaningful, that owners could agree to, that tenants could agree to, was really challenging. And in 2007, Representative Honan and my boss at the time, Senator Stu Tucker, worked in partnership to get a strong and meaningful bill passed. They spoke very publicly about that being their goal for the legislative session, and they worked with all stakeholders to get this done. They asked CHAPA to create a working group to work through the solutions, to work through the challenges that we were having in getting a bill to move and get passed. And they worked for months. They worked for months meeting with stakeholders, other legislators building support, and the Patrick administration to get it all done. So CHAPA's working group met for 2 months. They brought together a group that was really eager to solve this problem and to preserve our affordable housing stock. This included for-profit owners like Beacon and Wynn. It included nonprofit owners like community development corporations, tenant groups like Mass Senior Action, and also Greater Boston Legal Services. It included municipalities. Ultimately, the group was not able to solve all of the challenges that we were having in getting the bill passed, but it was really important work that the group did. They were able to reach agreement on the direction of the legislation, detail the areas where more work needed to be done, and the legislators could really pick up the ball and keep it going, and make a path clearer for a bill to get past that session. Meanwhile, there was constant activity from tenants and advocates calling for a solution. This was really important. They kept attention on this every day in the State House, outside the State House, and made sure that something was going to get done. Groups like Mass Alliance for HUD tenants, Mass Senior Action, and countless others. And there was a willing affordable housing owners who stayed at the table. They were determined to get something done. Again, Beacon, Wynn, Shockit, the community development corporations, everybody was really stayed at the table and wanted to get something done that session. And as Chairman Honan said, there were dedicated staff, me and Tom Flitwick, who worked for Chairman Honan, as well as the staff at CHAPA, Aaron Gornstein, Chris Norris, Sean Karen, and strong support from Peter Munkenbeck. There was constant work from all of these people for the entire legislative session, and really they were picking up the work that had been done for years before. So all of this, along with the strong leadership from Chairman Honan and Senator Tucker, and a ticking clock on both the legislative session and affordable units that were in danger of being lost, led to a bill getting passed. Now, getting the bill passed is not the end of the story. As we know from Bill's presentation, its success depends on many things. It depends on CEDAC, keeping track of the inventory, strong stewardship by the Department of Housing and Community Development, consistent advocacy for resources in both the capital budget or bond programs and the operating budget for programs like the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program. It requires strong tenant organizing, and active engagement with Chapter 40T is what leads to preservation. Now, it's clear that we need to keep working hard to preserve this precious housing stock, and as Priya talked about, we need to learn from it. We don't have enough restricted affordable housing. So how do we learn from Chapter 40T? How do we ensure that Chapter 40T continues to preserve our affordable housing stock, but also can we learn from the processes that were created, from the framework that was created to apply it more broadly to our naturally occurring affordable housing, to market rate housing. You know, right now we're at a point where we're seeing evictions, we're seeing displacement, a lack of housing production that has continued despite so many efforts to pick it up and to increase production to meet our needs. And we're seeing impacts particularly on households, Black and Brown households. So as we center racial equity going forward, and we center people with low incomes and want to, with a goal of helping people to stay in the neighborhoods that they've called home, what can we learn from 40T? You know, I look forward to analyzing it more and looking more closely at the data that Bill presents, but also the discussion that comes from this and the discussion that will happen over the next few weeks as this legislative session wraps up and we plan for the next legislative session. How do we use this bill, this law, and everything how this law was even passed to show us a way forward for the many policies and tools that we need to create to ensure that more people have long-term, safe, and affordable housing. So I'll just wrap up by saying I'm really proud of Chapter 40T. Even though I only played a small role in it, I'm very proud of what it's accomplished, and I really look forward to its continued success and learning from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for your long-term commitment to preservation and all things affordable, and for your leadership. Let's now turn to Suneeth.
Thank you, CEDAC, Bill and Roger, for the opportunity, and thank you, Rachel, for giving us a history of the law and how it came about. I'm Suneeth John, Director of Real Estate at Fenway CDC. Today, I hope to share a few details about our experience on two 40T transfer deals and to outline some aspects that help position a local CDC or a local designee organization like us to successfully execute on such projects. To provide a little bit of context, Fenway neighborhood where we work in is one of the most attractive neighborhoods in the city of Boston with respect to people who want to live and work there. So naturally the rents are very high and very unaffordable for a large percentage of the population. And that makes preservation deals like these really important. To date, Fenway CDC has been fortunate to be involved in two deals under 40T comprising of 149 units. These include a 52-unit Burbank Gardens and 97-unit Newcastle Saranac project. And each deal was different. The 52-unit Burbank Garden was one of the first 13A project that was transferred under 40T. And Fenway was one of the three local designees originally identified by the DHCD. And it also helped that the project was a stone's throw away from our office. So we were right, it was right there. So we acquired the building in April 2017 for approximately $15 million using help from CEDAC, of course, and with support from the city and the state, and later refinanced and rehabbed the building using 4% tax credit. But the story of Newcastle Saranac, the 97-unit project, is much more different and much more complicated. Initially, the seller was planning to transfer under the property under the Section 6A4 exemption, where another for-profit buyer would buy, but then preserve the affordability. But when that fell through, the deal went through a ROFO process, and the Fenway CDC as a designee partnered with Shockett Companies, the original buyer under the proposed Section 6A4 exemption deal, to come together and consummate the deal. On this deal, Fenway acted as the owner developer and Shockett Companies are our development partner. We acquired the building in early 2019 for approximately $30 million, and that was the largest acquisition loan ever given by CEDAC at that point. We also had tremendous support from the city of Boston, was able to tap into three inclusionary development project funds from three inclusionary development projects those were being developed in and around the Fenway neighborhood. The project was refinanced and currently undergoing rehab using 4% tax credits, funding from DHCD, Boston's D&D. We are using historic tax credits as well as because we had a dry cleaning business on property, we're using brownfield development funds, to name a few. Now that I've given an overview of the two deals, I can share, based on our organization's experience, a few factors that positioned us to successfully execute. And number one would be the visibility of the organization to the stakeholders, the public agencies and the local agencies that are involved. Nurturing relationships with DHCD, the City of Boston, CEDAC, to name a few, is very important, especially when these deals come through and quick decision making and support is needed. Now, of course, gaining trust with the elected officials. That leads to the question of what about the organization, the DNA of the organization? Well, Fenway CDC has been an organization which had tremendous success over the last 47 years in affordable housing development, preservation, and neighborhood activism, tenant advocacy, and community organization. So it helps that, it also helps that our organization has currently on staff who have folks who are with diverse experience, expertise, and long-rooted connection to the neighborhood. So they were able to really get out there and organize and deliver and get all the support that's needed to bring these deals to fruition. Now, no deal is perfect, and we can always have naysayers, face headwinds. So it is important that having staff and leadership who are passionate and ready to go out and fight hard, engage with the community, access political capital, so that beyond the acquisition, there has to be all the funding that needs to be layered up and stacked together, so that helps that the staff, we have a deep bench and engaged staff who has helped us bring that to fruition. But one also has to respect the board level leadership. We have a diverse board who are also members of the community, and them going out and helping raise the support among community and at the political level has helped us a lot. One other aspect of the board is how nimble is the board, because these deals happen fast, decisions have to be made. So how fast can the board, how much they are primed to move fast with approvals and board level boards, so that we can go and get these each steps quickly achieved. Another aspect that we identified, especially during the transfer process, is engagement with the property's current residents. As you can imagine, folks who live in the properties going through this process often face a lot of uncertainties, perceived or real, but at the same time, so a transparent and proactive engagement with them we found was very much valued and highly appreciated. Next, a couple more points. Next is what made the Newcastle project successful. It is our willingness to be open to partnerships with potential development partners, whether it's for-profit or other non-profits. A CDC like us can provide the mission and guidance, but an experienced partner can bring the expertise needed for such complex and complicated processes. Of course, they can bring in the strong balance sheet and ability to provide financial guarantees. And that's where Shockit companies came into the picture. They've done, as you can see from the list, they have done a few other projects as well. So they've been a tremendous partner in what was a very complicated deal with Newcastle. And I want to conclude by pointing out one more aspect. CDCs like ours, we don't do deals like this every day. So the experience, in-house experience is not that diverse or deep. So reaching out to experts or consultants, whether in housing or legal, is very important. And to do that at the early stages itself helps a lot in making the process smoother. And thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. And I look forward to any questions. And also, it was wonderful to hear from all the rest of the panelists. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Suneet, for walking us through those two important preservation transactions in the Fenway neighborhood. And now we will turn to Roberta. As you've heard regularly from virtually every speaker, the success of 40T really depends on DHCD's role as the key administering agency. And DHCD's legal division, headed by Roberta, has played that role very effectively. So, Roberta?
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. A couple of words before I get into 40T. I definitely appreciated Priya's remarks about thinking about preservation holistically, and also the balance between preservation and mobility. There's a real tension between seeking to provide meaningful options for all people to access homes in areas where high quality schools, access to jobs and transportation, and environmental quality cause them to be labeled areas of opportunity, while at the same time other households want to continue to live in areas where they may have strong family or community ties. As an agency, we are looking at ways to support mobility. We've been piloting a new Section 8 mobility program. We're also in the process of providing funding under our Section 8 MTW plan for fair housing testing and enforcement, specifically looking at some of the barriers to voucher utilization that have been highlighted in our recent analysis of impediments to fair housing. On another issue that's been mentioned, the risk of evictions during this pandemic, I'm going to put in this chat a link to DHCD's webpage about resources we are making available to help, including short-term rental assistance, which is payable to landlords on behalf of tenants, as well as a free community mediation program that can help landlords and tenants resolve problems without going to court, so please spread the word. But even looking at the concept of housing preservation through a holistic lens, the importance of preserving the affordable housing stock that we have increases with each passing year. I began my work as an affordable housing development lawyer in 1987, the year of the first LIHTC project closings. And many of the neighborhoods in which those early projects were developed have gentrified as real estate values have skyrocketed. Project costs have skyrocketed too, and despite the fact that we as a state do more than almost any other state to provide state-funded capital, state low-income housing tax credits, volume cap for tax-exempt bonds, and other financial support for affordable housing development, the high cost of development limits the number of projects we can fund. Preservation can be expensive, but new development tends to be even more expensive. Local zoning restrictions make it challenging to find places where new housing can be developed. And meanwhile, the waiting lists for subsidized housing remain long, and the supply of naturally occurring affordable housing in Massachusetts is limited. So if residents are displaced, their other options may be limited. Chapter 40T plays a critical role in the preservation of existing affordable housing. I think there are three things really important to highlight. Notification that provides an early warning signal to tenants, advocates, state and municipal officials, and nonprofit organizations so that they have the time to plan and potentially engage with the project owner. At the state level, this provides an opportunity for DHCD and quasi-public agencies such as CEDAC or Mass Housing or Mass Development to consider the availability of acquisition funding as well as the amount and timing of longer-term funding that may be needed. Process, there's a clearly defined process for engagement with owners and a clear opportunity for the state to intervene through a designee to preserve housing while assuring the owners the ability to sell their properties and receive a fair price. And protection for low-income tenants for a period of time after affordability restrictions expire by their terms. And that protection also can often create an incentive for owners to come to the table to discuss the potential for preservation. I do think the active participation of DHCD has been important to the effectiveness of 40T, and thank you, Bill, for your kind words. The role that we play in educating and assisting owners, I know that my colleague Caitlin Loftus is on this call, and Caitlin is sort of on the front lines for attorneys and others who are calling, asking, what is this thing 40T, if they're unfamiliar with it, looking for guidance about how the program works, about complex issues, and that educational and assistance role day in, day out, I think is very important to the effectiveness of this program. The designation process helps assure that the right of first offer and the right of first refusal can be exercised quickly and efficiently. Bill spoke about the fact that rights of first refusal are not often exercised in other states, and where the state itself has to be the party acquiring property, that's tough. You know, our agency doesn't own property. We don't purchase it, we don't manage it, we're not affordable housing owners. And so being able to call on qualified, competent, experienced designees to do this work for us is critical, particularly given the need for relatively short timeframes so that sale transactions can happen. Our ability to coordinate internally between legal and my colleagues in housing development to make rapid decisions about the exercise of the right of first offer or first refusal, and both internally and externally with our quasi-public sister agencies to think about flexibility in providing funding for acquisition and rehab within the timeframes that are needed for a preservation transaction to occur. Finally, the development of policy through guidance and rulemaking has allowed us to build on experience and allow the program to evolve as we have experience over the years. At times, our active involvement has been necessary to assure that designees have the opportunity to exercise their statutory due diligence rights. For example, some owners have refused to provide access for environmental testing or lead and asbestos testing or further investigations where initial visual inspections suggested the possibility of structural issues or roof leaks or other major problems that would be important to know when determining a reasonable offer price and thinking about the financing needed to not only acquire the property, but maintain it as safe, quality housing for the years ahead. The 40T requirement that owners send a notice of exempt sale or a notice of termination, and that they seek preliminary and final compliance certificates when carrying out an exempt transaction. Those procedural requirements provide opportunities for engagement with owners at critical points. And that's often resulted in improved owner compliance and helped smooth the way for preservation transactions. Curative notices to tenants, including extension of the affordability period where owners did not provide timely notice, not only provide the tenants their rights, but also create the space and opportunity to think about preservation. Recording agreements that memorialize the commitments of owners, create transparency for future owners and lenders and tenants. Now, as a state agency, we lack our own enforcement arm, but we can call on the assistance of the Attorney General's Office for enforcement, and we have done so in egregious situations. There are some things that 40T can't do, and we will not be able to preserve every unit as much as we do try. As Bill mentioned, if an owner wants to retain a property after the natural termination of affordability restrictions, DHCD has no power to force the owner to sell. The owner still has to give notices to the tenants, and the tenants still enjoy the statutory rent protections for the period immediately after a termination, but we can't prevent a market conversion by an owner who wants to hang on to their property. Resource constraints are another limiting factor. Where a project is in an extremely high-cost area, we have to consider the opportunity cost. If we fund that one project, what other important projects might not be able to be funded? Project-based vouchers have been used to help bridge these gaps, but we have a finite supply of vouchers too. Municipal funds have been critical to some high-cost preservation projects, but not all municipalities have deep pools of funding to offer, and even those that do still have a finite amount. In the low-income housing tax credit context, complex issues sometimes arise where the original investor has transferred his interest to another party whose primary goal is maximizing the return from a market sale or a conversion to market rate housing. As a final observation, it takes a village. Where 40T has been effective in preserving housing, it has been because of the efforts of many, many people working together, tenant advocates, resident organizations, affordable housing developers, my colleagues in housing development. A huge shout out to Kate Racer and her colleagues for the incredible work that they do on this. Public and quasi-public agencies, thank you CEDAC, Mass Housing, Mass Development, MHP, and municipalities. Thanks to everyone on this call. Your collective efforts make a real difference to preserving affordable housing for residents in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Roberta, for taking us through some of the complexities of administering this law and the kind of coordination that has to go on, often under very serious timing constraints given the rules under 40T, and also for alerting everyone to the resources that are available today to help folks deal with the pending eviction crisis. So we are now at the question and answer period of the program. And as Bill commented in the chat, we welcome questions from all attendees, and these questions can be directed to any of the speakers, including Priya or Bill or the panelists. And I'm going to do my best to moderate this. So our first question from Matt Fall is, for owners who refuse to sell, would it be feasible for the state to use its eminent domain powers to take the project? Presumably, this would require a new statute. Roberta, I'm looking at you as our resident attorney on the panel. Do you want to take a shot at that?
It's not something that we have actively focused on. I think there are a number of barriers to that. I think, you know, where you were talking about taking private property from one party and giving it to another, that definitely raises some significant legal issues. I think we probably would need statutory authorization. And it raises other complex issues such as funding. At the time when you do an eminent domain taking, you don't necessarily know exactly how much it's going to cost. Also, we're not property owners. So thinking about what would happen after the eminent domain and the disposition of that property raise some other complexities.
I would just.
I would add.
Sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would add that that was discussed back when CHAPA had convened the working group on, you know, on what could be a possible and strong bill to pass. And as the report in front of me from the group says, the conclusions were that it would be difficult politically, and also municipalities would bear a very large uncertainty as to the price, potentially for several years pending litigation as to fair market value. There were so many challenges to it, and we already do have an eminent domain policy in place that I think that just wasn't looked to. It just seems like that was not going to be a possible solution, or it just takes so many resources and really take years.
Thank you, Rachel. We have another question directed primarily for Bill, but anyone else with views are welcome to also try and answer. The question is, one concern for 40T seems like the potential for the right of first offer and right of first refusal to act as disincentives for future affordable housing developers, thus reducing affordable housing supply. Does this concern strike you as legitimate?
So this was a concern at the very beginning of the program. And you can think about it with any kind of regulatory tool that takes effect into the future. Would a developer change his behavior because sometime in the future there will be this potential for a right of first offer, right of first refusal? Well, what we've seen through 40T is really no discernible impact on that kind of behavior. So first of all, remember that most owners, when they're starting a new affordable housing project, are currently agreeing to at least 30 years of affordability. So any issue with the right of first offer, right of first refusal will be the present value of something that happens 30 years in the future. Probably not going to be a big determinant. But in addition, we've seen this very active process where owners who have an affordable housing project and want to sell it as an exempt transaction preserving affordability. They seem to have gotten reasonably comfortable that this process will get them market value or something very close to it, and the property will be able to remain affordable. So I think that's just one more win of 40T.
Thanks, Bill. Did anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, let's move on. We have a question from Emily Ochtenberg, who was certainly part of the active discussion leading up to the enactment, and I would add, worked on a wonderful report looking at the first 5 years of Chapter 40T that you can find on CEDAC's website. And I want to also just mention that Bill's report is now also available on CEDAC's website on the housing preservation page. Emily's question is directed to Roberta. Roberta, what can DHCD do at a policy level to help deter bad actions of aggregators who refuse to recognize the LIHTC right of first refusal, and which threatens to undermine successes of 40T in some projects?
Thank you for the question. This one's a tough one, but it's one that we're actively looking at internally. We recognize that this is an ongoing problem. One of the things that we are talking about is potentially including some language in the QAP, because that's under discussion. It's not something that I can really talk about publicly. I think also we are looking at best practices, and while this may seem like closing the barn door, at least in terms of existing transactions, I think on a going forward basis, it's important to make sure that that we recognize and require the use of best practices in terms of language in transaction documents that expressly acknowledges 40T, acknowledges that the right of first refusal is intended to be available without the need for further investor consent at the time of the end of the affordability period and the window within which the LIHTC ROFR can be exercised. So I do think there are some things that can be done, but we would welcome any other ideas that people have.
Roger, I want to jump in and give a shout out to Emily Achtenberg. She worked on the Burbank Gardens deal with Fenway CDC as our consultant.
Indeed. Thanks, Sunit.
Roger, I'd also add, and I imagine most folks saw this, that in October this year, there was a little bit of a win for maintaining or upholding the right of first refusal in the Opelika case in Florida. So those cases are increasingly being challenged in court, and there have been some setbacks in court, but this was clearly a victory.
Thank you, Priya. And we had our own success on that score with our friends from Homeowners Rehab, who won a very high-profile case that went to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court also on this issue, but it continues to be a challenge that we're seeing. We have a question from Michael Kane, who has been a tireless advocate for tenants in the preservation process. This question may be best answered by either Rachel or possibly Kevin, if you want to take a crack at it. The question is, would passage of Representative Honan's bill to lift the ban on local rent regulations help give localities the tools to prevent further loss of affordability, both for future expiring use and the 10,000 net units lost to the market so far? Anyone want to, Rachel, do you want to take a crack?
Sure. I think all ideas have to be on the table for what we do for preserving affordability. And this is certainly one of the more challenging policies in Massachusetts, as rent control was taken away many years ago. That being said, in the time since that happened, we see states starting to put in new policies around rent stabilization. So I think it's always something that we need to discuss, need to consider, while we also work for resources, more state rental assistance. I would also applaud Michael for the advocacy he's done for municipal and City of Boston rental assistance to help people continue to afford the rents in the area. So I think that there's we're at a really tough time right now where housing shortage has really, it's definitely at a crisis level combined with the crisis of the pandemic. And we have to get creative. We have to consider a lot of different policies and figure out just how we really do expand opportunities for people to have safe, affordable, permanent housing.
Thank you, Rachel. Anyone else have a comment on that? Okay. I am looking for any additional questions. We are approaching the end, but also just to the panelists themselves, if anyone has any questions for each other. I will offer one to Priya. We're just hearing word that President-elect Biden is intending to nominate Congresswoman Fudge from Ohio, I believe, to be the next HUD secretary. Given your national perspective and your DC base, Priya, and given the really, as Roberta mentioned, the holistic approach that you articulated so well, what would be the top items on your wish list that you want to bring to the next HUD secretary?
Good question, Roger. I'll tell you what I think they'll focus on, and then I think I'll tell you what I'd like to see them focus on. I think we all know that likely in a good way, AFFH will be restored. I think that there will be a natural focus on fair housing. Roberta talked about some of the things Massachusetts doing. I think this past year has highlighted the role that housing plays in outcomes, housing's implication in systemic racism. AFFH is a tool. It's not the end all be all. And let me say it's not perfect, right? I had the opportunity to serve in the last administration, and candidly, I wasn't all in. The 92 question questionnaire is a lot of work for cities. I think that it can be improved upon, but I think the spirit behind AFFH needs to be restored and will be. I do expect that there will be emphasis on energy efficiency. I think that's great. I think ARA was effective in promoting energy retrofits and weatherization for affordable housing. I expect that any program will probably be based off of the successful green retrofit program, and that's an opportunity. What I would like to see, and I'm not sure, it really depends on the team that's put in place, is a long-term view. And a systemic view. I think partly because housing is a discretionary appropriation, and given the election results in Congress, that's probably going to stay that way. I think historically we've always been in a defensive posture, and we cling to pretty old solutions and pretty siloed ones. When you think about PBRA and project-based vouchers and 202 and 811, what I would love to see is a vision for rental housing going forward. You're starting to see that for home ownership and wealth creation, but it hasn't emerged so much on the rental side of the comprehensive vision for where do we want rental housing to go. It's still personally irksome to me that we talk about public housing and then we talk about rental housing. They're all rental housing, right? They're all tools in a comprehensive rental housing system. And I think so much of the dynamics in our field result from those fiefdoms and really needing a rental policy strategy. I hope that Congresswoman Fudge is the person to do that. I think, you know, the fact that she's so aligned with Sherrod Brown, who chairs the Appropriation Committee is on the Senate side, is I think a good sign in terms of her ability to work with the Hill. I mean, one of my big takeaways from my time at HUD is, you know, so many people throw stones at HUD and they don't direct enough of their ire to Congress, who makes most of the decisions that HUD has to enact. So I think, you know, her relationship on the Hill hopefully will be a work to her benefit and the agency's benefit.
Thank you, Priya, and we so appreciate your voice in the upcoming work that is to be done on the Hill. Did anyone else want to respond to that? If not, we're actually very close to being on time, and there's one final comment, and I'm going to use the moderator's privilege to perhaps give the last word to my dear friend Vince O'Donnell, who has worked long and hard on this housing preservation issue for several decades, and who, among other things, does currently chair the Preservation Advisory Committee that Bill had referenced. And Vince just wanted to offer a shout out to the collaboration between DHCD and CEDAC and other sister agencies in the implementation, both administrative and in negotiating difficult situations. This isn't in the statute, but is part of how we decided to make it work. For other jurisdictions contemplating a version of this, it's an important lesson. So with that, I want to thank all of the panelists who have offered their thoughts and observations. I want to thank all of the attendees for participating in this. We are dealing with some very serious crises, not the least of which is a raging pandemic. I wish you all good health, stay safe, and best wishes for the season. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.